Dr. Bobbert and Price, Robert and Bob. What are the different views of hell? What did the Zoroastrian religion teach it to mean, since you've said before that the Jews adopted concepts from them, and I suspect hell was probably one of them, and it'd be interesting to hear if you want to comment on that also, where they might have got their idea from hell, if Zoroastrianism got it from somewhere or not. Why does the New Testament use the terms Hades and lake of fire, like in Revelation? Hell's cast into the lake of fire, Hades is cast into the lake of fire, depending on the translation. Have you ever heard that the lake of fire was the trash dump outside of Jerusalem called Gehenna? Some people literally are rationalists, and they'll say, Hades is the lake of fire, which is Gehenna, which is the trash dump, which is where the bodies of the Jews who died in the Roman-Jewish War were cast and forever burned, meaning they're gone. Kind of like Sodom and Gomorrah burned with an eternal fire. Some people say, well, it's not burning today, but when it burned by the eternal fire of God or whatever, it's done. Anyway, there's a lot of questions in there to unpack, I guess.
Well, the Zoroastrians, hard to date the particular concepts because their scriptures, which are voluminous, are a huge mess. We don't know when this one was written relative to that one and so on. But their idea of hell, they called it the house of the lie, whereas heaven was the house of song. And when you died, they had a few versions of this, you would be faced by a couple of angels, one at your feet, one at your head in the coffin. And I love the name of one of them, Visarsh. The idea was you would stand trial by ordeal, that every soul would have to walk on the knife edge of the bridge of the separator, the Chinvat bridge, and likely you'd fall off and go into the house of the lie, where there was fire and torments and so on. The Zoroastrians believed that Ahriman, the evil anti-god, the more or less even matched opponent of Ahura Mazda, that this was his domain. And that's interesting in terms of the Bible, because the Bible never says that Satan lives in or rules in hell. Where did that idea come from? You do find it eventually in Jewish lore, and you find it in the Acts of Pilate, Gospel of Nicodemus. We have this weird story about how there's a palace revolution and Satan is dethroned by Beelzebub. I mean, I'd love to know more about that. Anyway, that eventually made it into to Christianity. What was the deal with all the fire and so on? Well, they said that when, on the last day, when the Sail Cheyennes, or the benefactor, a virgin-born remote descendant of Zoroaster, would raise the dead for judgment, everybody would pass through a rain of molten lead. And this would, to the righteous, this would seem like a bath in warm milk. But for the wicked, they would either be forever damned or purified. The sin might be smelted out of them. And of course, if you were absolutely evil like Nancy Pelosi or the son of Sam or something like that, there wouldn't be anything left of you. Kind
of a purgatory state. In a sense.
Yeah, that's right. And so that came into Judaism, I would say, in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, because as I understand it, when Ezra came back with the law of God in his hand, he was a Persian official, though he was Jewish. But I understand that as meaning that he introduced Zoroastrianism into Judaism, and the ones that were influenced by it were the Essenes and the Pharisees. And in fact, the word Pharisee probably originally denoted Parsi or Persian Zoroastrian. So it probably entered in around then, which would be 5th century BCE. Was there a fiery hell in the Old Testament? Not really. There was the idea of Sheol, a dusty, shadowy, walled city where people just kind of shuffled around, unable to think clearly, and that God had abandoned them. He wasn't even aware of what was going on down there. He'd washed his hands of them. Well, who was the Anybody and everybody. Everyone went to Sheol, which means the pit. And this is like a kind of a rotten afterlife of it wasn't exactly a punishment. It's just where the shades went, and we hear about that quite often in the Old Testament. Sometimes it's hard to tell whether they mean you're just going to go to the grave, or if they mean it's actually a place, as it is in the Gilgamesh epic when Enkidu on his deathbed has a vision of Sheol and describes it to Gilgamesh, that it's a great walled city with barred gates. No one who goes there ever returns, and so on and so on. Well, then there was Greek influence, where you had this afterworld divided, because the Greeks in their eschatology had divided Tartarus, originally the cave world where Zeus had banished the Titans and the giants. This became the abode of the wicked who were tormented there, the wheel of Ixion and all these things. And then there was the Elysian field where the righteous went. And so we're getting toward a more modern view there. There had already been in Israel a belief in Tophet or Gehenna, which was a fiery nether world at the foot of Mount Zion. They believed that the temple at the top was a model of the universe, especially the heavens, and that it actually impinged on heaven. And in the same way, they believed in Gehenna as the subterranean kingdom of the god Molech or Moloch, and that he received human sacrifice of innocents, babies. This is mentioned plainly in the Old Testament. And of course, Yahweh received infant sacrifices at some point too. But the idea of this was not a realm of post-mortem punishment. Nobody was getting punished. These were just sacrifices to this god of the fire realm. That's a bit different, so that's not exactly hell. I mean, it's a horrible notion with the infant sacrifices. Nobody thought the kids had done anything wrong, and they were just feeding this awful deity. But you wind up with a fiery hell of torment and punishment because of a dispersion of Neo-Pythagorean missionaries, oddly enough, who went from Sicily all over the Mediterranean world teaching their doctrine, which included the hell eschatology based on the geography of Sicily, where they were from, where there were volcanoes and fumaroles and boiling geysers coming up from the ground. And this seems to have been the origin of the fiery hell, and occasional legends that people would sink into them in order to kind of get purgatory out of the way and come back alive. Empedocles supposedly did this. But that seems to be where it enters the biblical picture from Neo-Pythagoreanism. Let's see, what about Gehenna as the garbage dump? This was the theory of a rabbinic commentator, I can't think of his name offhand, in late medieval times, who figured, well, the Valley of Hinnom is what Gehenna means, and he thought, for whatever reason, that it was a dumping ground for unclean animal carcasses, and for the bodies of notorious, disgraced criminals who could not receive a decent burial, a church burial, we might say. So they just disposed of them. And that the fire was simply like the fire in a junkyard. New bodies and junk are added all the time, so you're fueling the fire. And the worm not dying, well, there are always maggots there because there's always new food for them. David Kimchi, I think was his name, that said that. Well, that makes a lot of sense, but it turns out not to be true, because archaeology, I mean, it makes so much sense even of what Jesus says. If your right eye offends you, plug it out, throw it away, your hand, your foot, same thing, because it's better to enter into life maimed than with body intact to be thrown into the Gehenna of fire. And that would make sense. Like, you're talking about guarding yourself from becoming a terrible sinner and deserving that kind of a burial. Makes sense, but archaeology shows that there's no evidence of bodies or trash there. We do know the sacrifices were made. Jeremiah talks about it and so on. But apparently that was just a bad educated guess. And that's too darn bad, because that if you don't like the notion of people going to hell for eternal torment, that's kind of a welcome way out of it. But unfortunately, it's just based on a misconception. Why do they call it Hades? Well, that seems to be, that comes from Greek religion, right? The realm of Zeus's brother, Hades, or Pluto. And that's the realm of the dead, too. It's synonymous pretty much with Tartarus, which the Bible also uses. In 1 Peter, I think, it speaks of the souls in Tartarus and the demons in chains there. They just borrowed it. They had it was in the neighborhood. Nobody had a copyright on it, and as with many things. So that's where that comes from. Now, does the New Testament teach an eternal hell? I think it probably does, though with qualifications. When Jesus says he's denouncing these cities where nobody accepted his message, Capernaum, Chorazin, whatever the other one was, I forget. He says, will you be exalted to heaven? No, I tell you, you will be brought down to Hades. This is an allusion to Isaiah 14, the king of Babylon, who, like Halal, the dawn god, the morning star, tried to exalt himself to heaven. I will be like the Most High. I will ascend the mountain of the assembly of the gods. But just like he got swatted down in the myth, the king of Babylon has been thrown down ignominiously to Sheol. All the kings of the earth are there to welcome a new king, but they were all given decent burials. Each has his own tomb, and they see poor Belshazzar, or whoever it was, the defeated king of Babylon, thrown in there like a sack of spoiled meat. And they say, well, you too have become like us, and so forth. And so if Jesus is paralleling, I think it's Bethsaida, Capernaum, and Chorazin, if he's drawing a parallel there, he's talking about Sheol, not really a hell. So that's problematic in terms of what's going to happen to individuals. Well, in Revelation, we hear that some at the judgment will be slated for eternal torment. The smoke of their torment goes up before the Lamb year in, year out, daily, forever. Well, that kind of implies they're burning forever. I'd say that's an eternal hell of torment. Matthew adds hell references to several passages from Q and other places where it didn't originally belong. There'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth and all that. Where did he get that? Well, there's a cue saying that Luke also has, where in Luke, Jesus says to the Jewish scribes and Pharisees that one day you'll be pretty bummed out when you see Joe Gentile and Pete Pagan coming from the east and the west to sit at the banqueting table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and you guys kick the heck out. There will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. It doesn't say what's going to happen. They're just really bummed out at being excluded. Well, so that doesn't refer to hell, but in Matthew it does. He takes that phrase and reapplies it. They're going to be thrown into the outer darkness or the oven or whatever, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So he adds that. But the real killer there is Matthew 25, the sheep and the goats story, where the nations, interestingly, who don't accept the ministry, the preaching of the wandering brethren of Jesus, the missionaries, they're going to be turned to the fire. He says, "Depart from me, you cursed ones, into the fire, the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels." Well, I used to think, well, that could just be annihilationism, like the Jehovah's Witnesses teach. The fire is eternal, but their suffering needn't be. But yeah, sure, it has to be. What's the point of the fire being eternal? And unless you're going to be cooking there till you're more than well done. So I think Matthew probably did entertain the idea of eternal hell of torment. But you don't find it in any Pauline document, whoever wrote them. There's no reference to anybody going to hell. All you have is the statement at the end of the age, when Christ comes back, he will destroy Christians' persecutors with the flaming fires of judgment, but that says nothing about what's going to happen to him afterward. And in 1 Corinthians 15, he speaks of each in his own turn, Christ the first fruits, raised from the dead, and then those who belong to him, and then he hands over the kingdom to the Father. Oh, wait a minute, what about those who don't belong to him? They're dead, that's it, they always will be. For Paul, resurrection is the same as salvation. They're not saved, they're not going to be raised from the dead. And as Paul would say, someone will say that in Acts, Paul says, I teach that there will be a resurrection of the righteous and the wicked. He doesn't say that in any of those letters. We know Luke thought that because he's got the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. So there's a variety of views there, and good luck coming up with a systematic theology of it. But all of this pales in comparison to the Buddhist hells. There are hundreds of hells and sub-hells characterized by the kind of fiendish torture you're going to undergo there for uncountable eons. And it's amazing to read this stuff. What kind of sadists came up with it? I mean, it's worse than Dante. It's worse than the Apocalypse of Peter, much worse. It's just shocking to read this.
This means you must convert to Buddhism or else.
Hallelujah.
Now, I did want to follow up on one quick question because our battery's running low on the camera. And you mentioned in passing, which I thought was interesting, in the Zoroastrian eschatology here, they are virgins. They are virgins in this tale that is dealing in their eschatology, which is Revelation. They're virgins, the 144,000 virgins, which is quite interesting that you paralleled that.
In Zoroastrianism?
Yeah, Zoroastrianism, you were mentioning something about virgins. You said they were virgins, and I can't remember what you were leading it up to, but this is in the topic of their hell, if you will. Something to do with their eschatology. I think you mentioned something about virgins. Now, I don't know if you meant the book of Revelation virgins, or if you were talking about Zoroastrian, but
the only thing I can think of with Zoroastrianism, I think I mentioned the virgin-born Saoshyans, the messianic benefactor who will raise the dead.
Yes.
A virgin-born remote descendant. In fact, they say that there's a sacred lake, which is basically a sperm bank, that Zoroaster supplied. And actually, there's a series of Saoshyants, but possibly 12 of them for every millennium. But the final one is born when a virgin bathes in that lake and unwittingly becomes pregnant with the Saoshyants, the final judge and benefactor.
Wow, that's kind of interesting, because back in the day, me and my brother used to have girlfriends in the jacuzzi in the backyard. And we used to say, I hope to God my mom never goes swimming in this jacuzzi, and God forbid she's pregnant with her own kids. Talk about some biblical stuff, right? There's Lot all over again.
Yeah.